Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about quitting. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, what is the number one thing that makes software engineers quit their job? So usually it is that they have become demotivated by the work environment. Uh, that's not usually the thing. The other thing is that they're sort of bored with what they're doing, or they feel like it's time to move on and do something greater and better, right? There are, of course, people who will just do it because they found somewhere else to work where they're going to pay them a higher salary, for example. That does happen as well. But I found on average that people move on because they're looking for something different, or they're sort of tired of the same old routines or things like that. Uh, and it's really easy actually sometimes to cause this sort of situation in software developers. Like demotivating a software developer is it's uh, it's usually something that happens when you're dealing with an organization who has a lot of incompetent stakeholders. uh, that is a very common reason as to why this happens. It's not always the stakeholders, like the middle managers and so forth. In some cases, it's actually other software developers. But the number one reason is almost always if you see a software developer quit and they sort of like say this standard, oh, I'm ready for new things, or etc. etc. It's usually because the management is incompetent. And this happens, good God, it happens a lot where you work in organizations. A classic one is that you have corporate developers who go to like these big companies where there is so much bureaucracy, so many meetings, so much swaggering and office politics and this, that, and like no communication. Like there's no way for you to get support, because the only way you can create a ticket on somebody else's backlog is if you talk to your manager, then they talk to their manager, and then that goes to the scrum master, that goes into the PI, like the next quarterly plan, and maybe they'll get back to you in a few months to help you debug those logs that is owned by them, even though you are the one who is like debugging the issue, etc., etc., etc. There's all this sort of involuntary friction and dependencies and things like that, and that usually gets to a lot of developers very quickly, because they have this sensation of being held back, or like that they can't move as fast as they want, or they can't work independently because there's so many people who are involved in everything they do. And this is usually down to, as I said, it's a management thing. Because I've worked in corporations where you sort of fixed this by, and it is a trend to a certain point. People want this more and more, where the teams should be self-driving and they should be autonomous and they should be able to own their own process and things like that, because it's very ineffective to divide a lot of the daily work between teams and cause these sort of very tight couplings between teams that are like requires like almost daily syncs in some cases, but for the most part they're independent entities, if that makes sense. So that is something that people get frustrated with really, really quickly. And so what they then do is that they go, well, this was bullshit, and then they might go into consultancy work, because then at least they're going to get paid a lot more for dealing with the same sort of bullshit. And they also have the option of kind of moving around. And in a way, I suppose there is a logic to that, because if you're going to deal with this sort of bullshit all the time, then at least you can get paid an insanely amount more than the people who work like in-house. And you have the option of trading one piece of bullshit for other pieces of bullshit. But for those who don't become consultants, they usually go into the startup world, and then they get into the startup world. If they're really lucky, they get like a really good startup, and that is, I have friends who are like blissfully happy in the startups that they've joined, because it's like working really well for them. I mean, the corporate developers have that too. I mean, if you want to be sort of happy in a corporate environment. You can get there as well. It's all about sort of the role and the company in question, right? That's always the case. But let's assume that they quit in the startup world. The reason most people quit in the startup world is usually because either there's another startup or something like more, once again, there's something more interesting. But a very common one is that they realize that there's a lot of short deadlines. A lot of startups basically depend or expect you to work very long hours or kind of go the extra mile for almost no pay, etc., etc. It can be a very stressful environment. And in many cases, you're dealing with very, very young and inexperienced managers who have, it's the same thing. It's like you still have office politics, you have all this sort of stuff, right? It's just that, and if a lot of the time in the startups, it's sort of, how do I put this? There is as with everything that is being done by the younger generations, there are things that are good with these sorts of things, but but there are also a lot of these sort of, well, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of how, when I talk to a junior level software developer, a mid-level software developer, a philosopher or something like that, where when you've been doing things for quite a few years and you talk to these people who they haven't really gotten as far, it gets very tiresome to go over the same, like it's sort of like teaching children to do something that you feel is sort of obvious. It becomes very tiresome, and then you have to stroke egos and you have to be very careful and like maneuver and so forth, because in a sense you're dealing with a person who you might be able to talk to them in a rational way and so forth, but you have to sort of realize that these, like the managers in the startups, they're usually learning as well. They're learning how to be managers. It's not that common. It does happen that there are like these really senior managers in the startup world, and these people are great. They're usually some of the best there are. But you have to be sometimes, and I've seen this quite a few times, you have developers who are, in many cases, they're very experienced, who go to a startup and they just get tired with dealing with like these 20, early 30s or like mid 30s, first time manager types who just like, they piss away money, they create all this type of friction, and they have egos and they have power problems, and like they can't really, it's like, as I say, it's like a child. You can't really deal with the responsibility of being the babysitter or something like that. They behave in a very immature fashion, and a lot of the and can cause all this sort of friction. And that is a very common reason why I see a lot of the more experienced software developers kind of go, no, you know what, the startup life isn't for me. Like, why should I sit here and like be stressed or like deal with all of this stuff and usually not get paid as well? Then once again, then it might as well just go and do it somewhere else where it's either a little bit calmer or things like that. So what I want you to take away from this is that the number one reason, usually that I've found at the very least, that software developers have for quitting their job, it's usually that they're fed up with dealing with the environment that they find themselves in. And it usually comes down to the same thing always, which is mismanagement within the company. You have a bad like architecture within the system, like the code base is rotting, or like there's some issue with like, there's usually, it becomes multiple factors, it's never one thing usually, but on average it is mismanagement of code and people and so forth that makes people kind of want to go, no, I will do it somewhere else. Sometimes you hear like they get paid better in somewhere else, but it's honest to God, it's most of the time just like that's the second thing. They always start the same way by saying that, yeah, I was ready for something different, or no, actually I found this other thing that was more interesting than the stuff we're doing here, or I couldn't really deal with this thing. And then the second thing they say is, and I get paid more over here, which is sort of the way it goes. You think that it's always about the money, but it's usually just one of the factors. It might be a big factor, but for the most part I find that people are just very tired of ineffective meeting strategies, or a lot of dependencies, or a lot of immature bosses, or like kind of just running around the place and causing a lot of issues and so forth. These sorts of things are the main reasons usually. Have a great day.